Hey gang, my name is James White and welcome to the Signalnoise broadcast. I put the word out on social media asking what kind of content you might want to see me cover here on the channel, and you've spoken. So today I'm going to go through my digital creative process, working through Illustrator and Photoshop to build an art piece based on one of the greatest pieces of gaming tech of all time, the original Nintendo Game Boy. Let's get to it. Okay gang, welcome to the inside of my computer. I did a little sketch before jumping into Illustrator just so I have a rough guideline on the vector shapes that I'm going to be building and where things are going to be landing, what perspective is going to look like. So I'm not too precious about the shapes early on. What I just need to get built are some stuff in Illustrator that I can mess around with, add some detail to, and eventually get into Photoshop and start adding the finishing touches. The Pathfinder palette plays a big part in my process, and I slowed it down just so you can see. I selected both of those shapes I just built, hit that third button in, and that knocks out all the shapes except for the areas that they overlap. So that's how I can get that shadow going down the side of the Game Boy. I've honed my creative process throughout the years to be almost an equal combination of Illustrator and Photoshop. So I use Illustrator to get the precision, the straight lines, the curves, making sure my shapes land exactly where I want them, and then move everything over to Photoshop so I can add some lighting, texture, and effects, try to make it look like they exist in a physical space as opposed to just being a combination of a bunch of flat vectors. So with this crosspad, I originally tried to design it on perspective, but then decided, nah, gotta draw it flat first and then move it into place. In hindsight, I could have done the entire front of the Game Boy in this method, drawn it flat, and then move it into place and then skew it all. But every once in a while I try to do that and the perspective kind of makes things a little bit bonky, things get a bit weird, and I end up having to illustrate things again. So I'd prefer to do it like this, illustrate it all on perspective as much as I can, but if I need to do something complicated, I'll illustrate it flat and then move it into place and skew it. When designing stuff like this, I've always abided by the law of the longer you spend with your vectors, the better the final piece is going to be. So the more time you spend smoothing things out, simplifying stuff, getting everything on perspective, adjusting your curves, adding detail, edge lines, shadows, anything that you can do in Illustrator that requires precision, ultimately the final piece is going to be better. Even when it comes to correcting mistakes. So you can see me right now, I'm screwing around with that shading that goes down the side because I mismatched my points at the top and the bottom, so things weren't lining up properly and I had to go back and forth to try to fix that. So ultimately I got everything back into place, and then I'm going to go back in and add another layer of shadow to that side. Just because the Game Boy has curved edges, there's no solid corners on a Game Boy. So I went in and added a second level of shading just to give the illusion that it might be a curve going on that side. Up until now, I've been pretty haphazard with where I've been putting my points and what my shapes have been lining up with. So I got to adjust my perspective. In order to do that, I don't use the perspective tool because that thing sort of freaks me out. It's really big and unruly, and every time I open it, I can't figure out how to close it. So I'm going to do my own version of that. So I put two lines at the top and bottom of the Game Boy, and now I'm going to use the blend tool, selecting specified steps, and I'm going to click on the top line and the bottom line, so that will put lines in between those two that I can use as a rough guide to line up my perspective. And I'm going to pop open the blend tool periodically throughout this part of the video so you can see me bumping those numbers up and down to try to find lines that are close to where, say, the top of the screen is, so I can then adjust those points on the screen and have everything line up on the same plane. This is a really handy trick that enables me to fake perspective whenever I need it. And I'm not just trying to guess where those edges are lining up, because I've made a lot of pieces of art where the perspective just looks bonky and I can't really figure out why. So I need these guidelines in place in order to help me line things up properly so everything looks like it's on the same plane. And after I did the perspective widthwise, I'm now going to do it lengthwise. So getting those lines lining up with the edges and then using that blend tool again to get my lines in there, adjusting the number of steps in between, and then moving those points into place. So a Game Boy is deceptively simple in its design, but in order to make an illustration look right, you gotta get that perspective down. It's just, there's no way around it. Game Boys also have a lot of plastic meeting plastic edges, and trying to mimic that in Illustrator is pretty easy, but again, you gotta make sure those lines are on perspective with everything else. So even if that means drawing the line all the way to the bottom and then shortening it just to make sure it lines up with the damn edge, you gotta do those things. And here's another instance that I'm going to use the blend tool to make those speaker lines. So making one line, getting it adjusted to the width and the rounded corners, duplicating that line, I'm going to then pop open the blend tool and set the specified steps to 4 so I can get those 4 lines in between. Click on that one, and then I get those 4 in between. Then moving those into place, and it's just another use for the blend tool. I use the blend tool quite a bit in this illustration. It's just something that's come in insanely handy in so many different situations. So if you're not accustomed with using the blend tool, or you've opened it up and said, what the hell am I going to use this thing for? I highly recommend trying to do little exercises to get to know that tool, because it comes in very handy when you're dealing with repetitious shapes. These sorts of illustrations live or die by the amount of detail you put into them. So under normal circumstances, I would just leave that shadowed edge just to be black, because you're not going to see a lot of detail in there. But every time I add detail, little edges and things that shouldn't be visible, it just adds to the overall piece. It fleshes out a lot of the shapes. So that's something I spend a lot of time trying to work out. What detail can I put into shaded areas that just gives the piece more life? Here's another example of how strong the blend tool is. So we're going to go back to these speaker lines. I'm going to get my pen tool and I'm going to put a couple more points on these lines. There's one point on that first line and another point on that second line. Grabbing my white arrow tool and selecting those bottom points on both of those lines, I'm going to nudge those points over, and you're going to see the lines in between also bending to the same angle. That's because the blend tool is still active on those elements, and that is very handy when you're trying to do something that requires a slight edit to something that you made earlier. Now see what I do right here? I make the Game Boy a little bit wider. That's a dangerous move, because now I can't use the guide, the sketch that I have next to it anymore. I'm out in the woods and I have to build elements independent because the perspective doesn't line up and the width doesn't line up with anything else. I have to be really careful about when I do something like that. If I skew the illustration or I change the width or the height, and it blows apart a previous sketch or guide, because now I'm over here trying to goof around with my perspectives just to get the cross pad lined up, and I had to adjust all of my perspective lines on the top and bottom because I changed the width. You got to be real careful about when you decide to stray from your original sketch, because you don't have your blueprint anymore. So now we've moved over to Photoshop, and I don't want to bore you with watching me copy and paste everything. My basic rule of thumb is try to keep elements separated that you want to color and add effects to. Try to keep them on their individual layers. If you need to pause the video, feel free to look at what layers I have separated in the layers palette. They're all there and they all should be labeled. So once I get into Photoshop, what I'm doing is I'm adding effects, textures, and lighting to layers that are on top of the individual smart objects. So you'll see me adding some gradients that have the diffuse setting turned on, that adds some nice noise, and setting blending modes to overlay or screen. What I'm trying to do is bring out a three-dimensional aspect to these otherwise flat vectors, trying to make it look more like a physical object than they did before. Now, one thing I do when I'm illustrating these things is I start getting hung up on what the background looks like. So you'll see me adding highlights and shading and stuff back there, which I shouldn't do. It's just a waste of time. The background is only going to make sense once the foreground object is complete. So you're going to see me doing that every now and then, and I gotta knock it off. See, I'm putting colors back there. What the hell am I even doing? Just worry about the Game Boy, you jackass. I got some really good advice to do with levels early in my career. My boss told me that when you pop open the levels initially, slide the leftmost and the rightmost arrows just around where those waveforms start to show, because that's going to bring out your highlights and it's going to bring out your shadows without being super overbearing. And once you have that in your head, that gives you a loose guideline on where they kind of should be. If you open up levels and just start firing arrows all over the place, it's just going to get really confusing really quick. So that was a good rule of thumb. All right, so here we go, adding some text. I love adding little words and text to my pieces because, number one, it adds some nice detail and it can fill in space and add a little bit of interest. But also it's a great opportunity to put Easter eggs in your work. So early on in my career, when I was working at a newspaper office, I used to design ads that would be printed in the newspaper, and I would always put Easter eggs in those things, like putting little words like 9 Inch Nails lyrics or whatever, like hidden in the borders of newspaper ads. And not once did I ever get called on any of these stupid little things that I put in these ads. And I was probably printing stuff I really shouldn't have been printing in the newspaper, but I never got in trouble for it, so my apologies go out to the Truro Daily News circa 1996. The font that I use in almost everything these days is Eurosteel. I use the extended version. I really like that because it has this cool, like, science fiction look, but I also use the normal version for a lot of the stuff that you see here on the YouTube channel. I get asked quite a bit about my outer glow treatments, so I'm going to just show a little bit of how I do this. What I'm doing is applying an outer glow to a duplicated layer of the overall Game Boy shape, like the body. So you'll see me adjusting it there. I add a little bit of noise. I set it to overlay so it pops off the background a little bit. But then I add a layer mask on top of it. I'll grab my gradient tool, set to normal, because I want this to be a pretty smooth gradient, and I'll mask out the bottom portion of that layer. So what that does, it gives the illusion that the light is sort of bouncing off that upper left-hand portion. It's really subtle, but it's just enough to pop it off that background and make it look a little bit more like a physical object. Here's another little technique that I like doing with these illustrations, adding a little bit of an edge line around the side where the light is hitting. Again, it's really subtle. I think I might have the layer set to overlay. It adds a little bit of dimension to those edges. It's super subtle, but if you manage to match up that line with all of the edges, like where the light would be hitting, if it's a little indentation or along the edge of the screen, if you do that for the entire piece, or at least on the most important parts, it will add this three-dimensional aspect that just wasn't there before. Like I said, it's really subtle, but if I were to turn on and off those layers, you'd see what I mean. It's a really good way and a really simple way of making the object look a little bit more physical and separating it from any of the background colors if that gets muddy. And I add those edge lines to the edge of the screen as well. On an actual Game Boy, the screen is glass and kind of inset into the plastic, but for mine, like, it looks like it's a little bit more raised, but that's okay by me. As long as it looks cool, that's all that matters. So at this point in the process, I'm really trying to concentrate on where that lighting is landing. So if our light source is in the upper left, I'm trying to put all the shadows on the lower right. So you'll see me doing that on these select and start buttons while adding some strokes around those smart objects just to make them look a little bit more button-like, you know, like they're inset in plastic. Adding a bit of shadows onto the A and B buttons, again, just to try to add a little bit more of a three-dimensional aspect to these otherwise flat vectors. The A and B buttons and the crosspad are hard plastic on an actual Game Boy, so what I'm trying to do is mimic where that light source is going to be hitting them. Normally, I would do this freehand, but sometimes I'll grab the line tool just if it saves me a bit of time and fix up anything with the brush tool. The brush that I'm using is one of the Kyle Webster ones. I think it's a really straightforward, simple inking brush that whenever you see me kind of going in and adding those little curves and whatever. Those darker areas behind the A and B buttons and the crosspad are supposed to be inset. If the light was hitting from the upper left, it would cast a shadow on that same side to make it look like they're kind of curved or inset. And again, I'm adjusting my text to make sure it lines up on perspective. All the text on a Game Boy is just printed, you know, normal plastic ink or whatever, but I tend to give all my text a little bit of a drop shadow, abiding by where the light source is, to make it look like it's slightly raised, but ultimately it just makes the text look a little bit clearer than it normally would. I also wanted to address those speaker lines because they look super boring just being full black, so I just command selected it, moved the marquee down, and just colored, give it a gray color to make it look like there's plastic inside of that too. Off camera, I built this little Zelda heart. I didn't want to include it in this episode because it's just me moving squares around. It's super boring, but I made that in Illustrator, copy and pasted it into Photoshop, and then I can skew it, move it into place, just to add a little bit of love to this final piece. For every illustration that I do, I typically get to a place where I want to add some more details, and I gotta figure out where those details are gonna land. So I'll actually sketch over top of this on a separate layer, just so I have an idea of what I can then go back into Illustrator and build before importing it over and putting it into place. So I had some different buttons and lighting ideas and these little stripes that are gonna go down in the lower left-hand corner. I kind of always default to these stripes whenever I need a little bit of detail to like bleed off the corner of something or put on somebody's clothing in an illustration, because they remind me of like the design that would be on an aerobics outfit or a workout outfit back in the 80s. That's where you go for inspiration, right? So in that sketch I just showed, I had these like lines right below the screen that I wanted to put in. They have to line up with the curve of the screen, but also line up with the height of the Game Boy word, which presented a little bit of a challenge, and I had to go back and forth between Photoshop and Illustrator a few times and monkey around with this vector element to try to get it to line up properly, like curving the edges and whatever else. And again, I'm using that blend tool to make those lines go from thick to thin. And this is a technique I use to make all those Broken Sun designs, like in the Gunship album covers and stuff. So it's the same sort of thing, but I'm trying to figure out how wide to make them, where they're going to start and end. I had to go back in and undo what I did to make more lines, make them wider. So this was a little bit of a challenge to go back and forth with, but I got it on the second or third try. And of course, once I get it into place, I'm going to put some gradients over top of it. I'm going to add an outer glow. Again, just to throw off the fact that it's just a flat vector object. The same with these stripes down at the bottom. I noticed that I need a little bit of shadow on the bottom to match up with the shadow line that I had along the bottom of the Game Boy. We're in the business of faking the third dimension here, so we got to do everything we can to make everything look like it's synced up. And the Game Boy has these little grip lines that go down the side. I don't really need to be spending too much time doing this sort of thing because that edge is really heavily shadowed, but as I said before, the more detail you put into the final object, the more fleshed out it's going to look and the more successful the piece is going to be. This is the part here that, because I'm not adhering to any blueprints, I'm going to do a lot of goofing around and, you know, ultimately wasting time. And I know that, you know, you got to try stuff to see what works and what doesn't, but if I had this properly sketched out, I'd know that I'm going to add some buttons over there. So this is me putting stuff in that I'm ultimately going to change. But you just got to try it. It's trial and error a lot of times, so you got to give stuff a shot. And like I established earlier, every single element that I put in here, I'm going to give it some kind of a treatment to not have it be just a flat vector object. That's ultimately what I'm trying to get rid of in this. I can still maintain the precision of Illustrator, but I really want this to look like a physical object as much as I can, in a cartoony way, I suppose. While building this, I noticed that the Game Boy has these little grips on the control pad, and I've never noticed them before, these three little lines, so, which is a good thing because the cross pad this entire time didn't really look nice to me because it still looked like just a plain vector object. So getting those little details in there definitely helps flesh out that area and just make it a little bit more interesting, a little bit more real. But man, I tell you, lining up that perspective was not easy. It should also be mentioned that I learned Illustrator and Photoshop back in 1995 and 96. When you see me building this stuff, I'm not doing anything that's overly complicated because I haven't learned anything since then. And I'm not adverse to new technology at all. And of course I pick up new skills and whatnot over the years, but ultimately I'm using the same techniques that I used back then, which I think is conducive to making videos like this because I'm not doing anything that's overly complicated. I really wanted to add reflection lines on this screen, and I tell you, these things gave me no end of hell every time I tried to put them in here. What I couldn't have the reflection lines doing was interfering with the perspective or the pixels of the heart. I didn't want it going over top of the battery line, and I didn't want it interfering with the text at the top of the screen. So I had to find a place that looked natural, but also didn't interfere with any of my elements. Oh, and of course I'm gonna stick my logo somewhere. I was looking for an idea to balance out the battery light over there, and I thought, hey, what better opportunity to put my logo in this thing? So it's a Signalnoise Game Boy, so, you know, And here I go, I'm goofing around with the background colors again. Oh man. Now here I'm adding some white edge lines down this side. Now this sort of doesn't abide by the science that I laid out earlier, that these edge lines should only land on the side where the light is hitting. But I threw these in and they just look cool. This doesn't work all the time, putting a light edge between one area that's supposed to be shadowed, but I put it in and it worked, even though I'm breaking my own rules. So at this point, what I realized is that the Game Boy looked too thin. So what I did was I mocked in a rough, like, thicker outline, a thicker edge, and you'll see me turning that layer on and off. So I roughed that in, it looked better, but now I have to go back to my smart objects and change the width of the entire body of the Game Boy and those 2 or 3 shadowed edges on the right-hand side. So you'll see me in Illustrator adjusting those things to make them wider. I threw some guidelines in there to make sure that the element lands in the same place, but then having to go back and forth to adjust these shadows is just more of the ditch digging part of it, you know? And it's hard to keep these things straight later on. This is something I try to have my blueprint in place early on in order to avoid. So now you'll see like I'm goofing around with these edges and things aren't lining up and I have to go back and forth, make things wider. Luckily I have things set up in clipping masks over in my layers palette. So sliding them around isn't that big of a deal. All they need to do is line up with the interior edges of the Game Boy, if that makes sense. Where the shadows meet is ultimately the only lines that I need to worry about. But I got it figured out. It took me about a half hour or something, but got it all done. And for some reason I lost my highlights on the control pad. I don't know how that happened. And this time I'm not using the line tool, I'm just going in with that inker, that Kyle Webster inker. And I try to do that just because it adds a little bit more of a handmade quality to the overall piece, because if you're only using the line tool, it's going to look pretty mechanical, and I want this to be, you know, a piece of art, not a super accurate representation of what a Game Boy should look like. Obviously, look at those colors. So here I am going back and adjusting what those buttons are going to look like on the side. I think that's where the volume knob is on a Game Boy. I went off model at this point because I wanted to add more detail to that side because it was just looking kind of boring. So I figured I'd add a couple of buttons in different colors. And again, trying to line up the perspective on those buttons because this thing live or dies based on getting that perspective right. Duplicating the buttons, I'll make one blue and one orange and one pink. And again, it's just to add more detail onto that side. They don't make any sense, but hey man, they look cool. And that's the final goal, isn't it? It's gotta look cool. The previous piece of art that I launched was a Walkman. It's like a Sony Walkman, and I built it much in the same way that I'm building this Game Boy, and that one had a lot of like buttons and switches going down the side, and I just really liked what it looked like. So that's what I'm trying to do here, is just to add more interest onto every edge of the Game Boy. And adding those outer glows as well. It's much like the outer glow I mentioned earlier. A little rule of thumb is always make the glow a slightly darker color than the object that it's illuminating, because the light is supposed to be the button itself, so that should be the brightest part of that element. So always make your outer glow slightly darker and in the same hue as the thing that it's illuminating. And here we go, we're back with reflections, and I managed to sort it out this time. It all came down to setting the blending mode to overlay and keeping the reflections kind of limited to the bottom of the screen. So you'll see like the colors are interacting better with it right now. And I'm going to add some gradient on there too to kind of fade it off the bottom, because I don't want those things to be super bold. I just want to give the illusion that there's glass on that part of the Game Boy. And there might be the light that's illuminating the right side might be hitting the screen, who knows. There I am goofing around with the background color again. Idiot. A staple in most of my artwork are lens flares. And this element in particular, which will no doubt be referred to as a truck stop flare by the old school noisers in the comments, is an element that I've been using for a number of years now. So if you look at any of my artwork, you're going to see that same element at work. The final step in this is a lot of polish. So I'm going to be adjusting levels, adding different hues and different shades and different spot highlights to try to, it's my last effort to bring out the three-dimensional aspect of this piece, and trying to figure out if all of the details are in place that need to be in place. And this is my favorite part of the entire process. And I'm still goofing around with those reflections. They still don't look right, but I've discovered that if I duplicate one of those lines, overlay it on top of the other one, I can get a nice sort of bold line going down the screen, which it just makes it look like it's being hit with a light source, while not being too overbearing. So here I am goofing around with that stupid thing at the bottom again, and I think I decided at this point that I'm just going to put LED lights in it. We're already off model when it comes to a Game Boy, and LED lights always look good, so I put some of those in there. Little useless lights, their only job is to look cool. And I'm using the same effects that I've been using throughout this piece. It's a gradient to overlay on top of the asset itself, so I can get the orange and the blue and the pink and the same sort of outer glows on the side of the Game Boy. And I finally figured out how the background works. The darkest part behind the lightest part of the foreground and the reversal on the bottom, so dark on light. And I added a little bit more reflection to the screen to make it look like a bit more like glass. And then we got a final Game Boy. At least a Signalnoise Game Boy. Hey Nintendo, get at me, let's build this thing. I hope this video showed some tips and tricks that you might be able to apply to your own illustrations in the future. But if there's anything else you'd like me to cover, please leave a comment below and let me know. I would love to hear from you. So thank you very much for swinging by, gang. If you want to show some support for the channel, just like, subscribe, tell a friend. You can drop by the Signalnoise store to see what merch I might have available. I also set up a brand new Patreon if that's your thing, and I plan on using that for lots of creative behind-the-scenes content in the future. So thank you very much again for swinging by. My name is James White, and this is the Signalnoise broadcast. Stay rad.